Peter Gerard Scully was born on January 13, 1963, in Melbourne, Australia. Little is known about his childhood, though it is believed he was raised by strict Scottish-Irish Catholic parents. After graduating from university, Peter made a fortune in real estate development. By the mid-2000s, he lived with his wife and 2 children in a large 4-bedroom house in suburban Melbourne, enjoying a life that many would envy. However, his world began to crumble in 2011 when he and his business partners were forced to declare bankruptcy after one of their development projects collapsed. Despite little work being done on the actual construction site, Peter and his company claimed that every cent of the $6 million investment fund had vanished. Investors were furious and filed lawsuits against Peter and his partners. While Peter claimed he could legally account for the losses, in reality, he had been preparing to flee the country for years. He had defrauded investors in what amounted to a cleverly disguised Ponzi scheme. By the time Peter acted illegally, he had already escaped Australia using a fake passport and created a new identity in Manila, Philippines. After establishing a degree of anonymity and knowing that Manila would be the first place Philippine police would look for him, Peter traveled by land and sea until he reached the southernmost island of Mindanao. It was here that Peter began building a new life for himself. Although he had fled Australia with a significant amount of investors' money, his extravagant lifestyle meant he would soon be broke again. Peter needed a way to make money quickly, but he couldn't do so legally, as it would almost certainly reveal his whereabouts to the authorities. Unafraid of operating outside the law, Peter turned to the darkest corners of the online black market: child exploitation. With the help of 2 Filipino women, Karma Alvarez and Leo Margaro Castaña, Peter set up one of the most depraved child exploitation websites in contemporary history. Alvarez and Castaña would travel to some of the poorest towns and villages in Mindanao, offering financial compensation to parents who were willing to hand over their children for photo sessions. Days later, the children would return visibly traumatized but carrying large sums of cash. They never spoke of the horrors they endured under Peter and his so-called girlfriends. Those who did try to speak were either silenced or ignored. Abuse was recorded and uploaded to a dark web messaging forum Peter created, called No Limits. The most infamous video, titled Daisy's Destruction, depicted the despicable abuse of 3 underage Filipino girls. A preview was uploaded to the site, while Peter offered the full unedited recording to visitors for around $10,000 USD. One of the most active abusers in the footage was 19-year-old Liesl Margallo, who had herself been trafficked at a similar age to the children she now abused. For 5 long years, Peter and his accomplices continued trafficking and abusing children. However, Karma Alvarez began to have second thoughts. Though Peter's routine was simple: lure parents into handing over their children, record their abuse, then return them with cash, his actions became too much for her conscience to bear. She pressured Peter to raise the age of the victims and introduce alcohol to numb the girls during the abuse. Peter seemingly agreed, and in 2015, he lured 2 teenage girls to his home with promises of food and drinks. Initially, the girls came voluntarily, but upon realizing Peter's true intentions to abuse and record them, they tried to escape. Peter captured the girls as they attempted to flee, beating them savagely and dragging them into his wine cellar. There, each girl was forced to dig her own grave before Peter declared they would be buried alive. The girls begged for their lives, swearing on everything dear to them that they would never reveal what had happened that night. Convinced their fear would silence them forever, Peter decided to release them, but not before keeping them captive for a few more days to ensure his message was clear. It was during this captivity that the girls were discovered by Karma Alvarez, who was horrified by Peter's actions. Waiting until Peter left the house, Alvarez freed the girls from their restraints and helped them escape. She then drove to the nearest police station and recounted the harrowing story to a pair of stunned officers. To dismantle Peter's dark web exploitation network, Philippine authorities enlisted the help of the Dutch national team against child exploitation. International barriers in the investigation fell quickly. Renowned Dutch detective El Hamoudi led the charge. Everyone wanted the same thing: to bring those responsible to justice. White hat hackers from the Netherlands swiftly breached the website's digital defenses, a breakthrough that revealed one of the largest collections of exploitative images police had ever encountered, with hundreds of thousands of images depicting thousands of potential victims. Peter's contributions were just the tip of the iceberg. But what alarmed investigators most was the overwhelming demand for new content. Though the exact number of Peter's sales was never disclosed, millions of dollars worth of cryptocurrency seized from his digital wallet spoke volumes. When it came time to arrest Peter, an international dragnet ensured he couldn't flee the Philippines or surrounding territories. Police eventually tracked him down to Missilbul City, where he was arrested on February 20th, 2015. His capture also led to the arrest of another Australian predator, 22-year-old Matthew Graham, alias Lux Graham, who operated several hurt-core websites on the dark web specializing in violently exploitative child pornography. During his trial, Graham shocked attendees by claiming he acted in the name of freedom. At his own trial, Peter Scully faced a total of 75 criminal charges, most related to child trafficking and exploitation. He was tried alongside two other men, a Brazilian named Jano Caetano de Almeida and a German named Christian Ruch, both of whom played key roles in recording and distributing Peter's crimes. Some videos were shown to the jury, who described scenes of a girl suspended upside down while abuse occurred. The footage was so graphic that several jurors sought psychological counseling afterward, and prosecutors admitted to being traumatized by the end of the trial. "This is the most horrific thing I've ever seen," said prosecutor Ruby Malog. "I cried while watching it, and I feel like crying right now just talking about it. It's hard to believe what I witnessed, and even harder to believe someone could do such things to children." A senior official at the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime called the case the most horrifying she had ever handled. Peter's crimes were so severe that the Philippine government considered reinstating the death penalty, which had been abolished less than a decade earlier. "If I had my way, I'd execute Scully," said lead prosecutor Jamie Oompa of Northern Mindanao. "We need to send a strong message to others that if they come to the Philippines and torture and abuse our children like this, they will face the full force of the law and be executed." During the trial, Peter appeared to joke and laugh with his co-conspirators. But when he was convicted of 1 count of human trafficking and 5 counts of child molestation, the humor faded. 6 charges were enough to secure a life sentence, but not all of Peter's crimes were resolved in that trial. In November 2022, Peter received a second sentence of 129 additional years in prison. His more remorseful accomplice, Karma Alvarez, was sentenced to life with the possibility of parole, while Leo Margaro Castaña received 126 years for her active role in the exploitation. 2 other accomplices, Alexander Lau and Maria Dorothea C.H., who played smaller roles, were sentenced to 9 years each. Since his incarceration, Peter has complained about the conditions in the overcrowded prison where he is held, citing poor nutrition and declining health. Prison warden Ferdinand Pontio told reporters that Peter demanded luxuries like gourmet food and a mobile phone to make international calls. He wants the same conditions as Australian prisons, but this isn't Australia, Pontio said. Built to house no more than 350 inmates, the facility now holds nearly 2,000 prisoners as of November 2022. It's hard to feel sympathy for a man who showed such contemptible lack of mercy or empathy toward the lives he destroyed for his own depraved financial gain. Perhaps the scariest aspect of Peter's case is that imprisoning him has done little to stem the ongoing effort to eradicate child exploitation worldwide. Many monsters like Peter still lurk in the darkest, most forbidden corners of the dark web, disseminating humanity's most vile, unforgivable acts. The only silver lining is that for every predator hiding in that shadowy underworld, there are countless dedicated law enforcement officers determined to bring them to justice. So my name's Jake, and back in late 2024 I was pulling night shifts at the county morgue in this small town out in Indiana. I'd been working there for about 6 months, long enough to get used to the quiet, the cold, and the fact that my coworkers were, well, not exactly the talkative type if you catch my drift. It wasn't glamorous, but the pay was decent, and I'd always been kind of a night owl anyway. Plus, I figured it'd be a chill gig, move some bodies, file some paperwork, maybe sneak a smoke breakout back when the supervisor wasn't around. Most nights, that's exactly how it went. Most nights. But there was this one shift, November 17th, I'll never forget it, that turned everything upside down. It was a Thursday, just past midnight, and the air outside was biting cold, the kind that sneaks through the cracks in the windows and makes your bones ache. Inside, the morgue was its usual sterile self, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, the faint hum of the refrigeration units, and that sharp antiseptic smell that never quite masks the undertone of decay. I was alone that night. My buddy Tom, who usually worked the shift with me, had called out sick with the flu. No big deal, I thought. I'd handled solo shifts before. The night started slow. I'd just finished logging a new arrival, a Jane Doe, mid-30s car accident victim, into the system. Poor girl didn't have much left to identify her. The crash had done a number on her face. I slid her into drawer 12, one of the refrigerated slots in the back wall, and shut the door with that heavy metallic clunk that always echoes a little too loud in the silence. Paperwork done, I kicked back at the desk with a cup of coffee that tasted like burnt rubber and scrolled through my phone trying to kill time. That's when I heard it. At first, it was faint, just a little tap, like someone flicking a fingernail against a table. I figured it was the building settling. Old places like that creak and groan all the time. But then it came again, sharper this time, and it wasn't random. It had a rhythm. Tap, 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 consistent, deliberate. I set my coffee down and listened harder. It was coming from the back where the drawers were. Now, I'm not the jumpy type. You don't last in a job like this if every little noise sends you running. But something about that sound rubbed me the wrong way. I grabbed my flashlight, not because the lights were off, but because it felt good to have something in my hand, and headed toward the storage area. The tapping kept going, steady as a metronome, and as I got closer, I realized it was coming from the wall of drawers. Specifically from drawer 12. I stopped about 5 feet away and just stared at it. The steel door looked normal, shiny, cold, no dents or scratches. But that tap-tap was unmistakable now, muffled but clear, like something inside was knocking to get out. My brain went into overdrive trying to rationalize it. Gas buildup, maybe? Sometimes bodies do weird shit post-mortem. Muscles twitch, air escapes, makes noises. I'd seen it before, but this wasn't a twitch or a hiss. This was intentional. I took a deep breath, told myself I was being an idiot, and stepped up to the drawer. The tapping stopped the second I got close, like whatever was making it knew I was there. My hand hovered over the handle. Part of me wanted to yank it open and prove it was nothing, but another part, the part that was screaming in the back of my head, said to leave it the hell alone. I compromised. I tapped back. 2 quick knocks with my knuckles right on the drawer door. Silence. Dead silence. And then from inside, tap tap. Same rhythm, same force, like it was answering me. I stumbled back, heart slamming against my ribs. No way, I muttered out loud, because saying something, anything, made it feel less insane. I stood there, staring at the drawer, waiting for it to happen again, but it didn't. Just the hum of the fridge units and my own breathing, way too loud in my ears. I started second-guessing myself. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe the coffee was laced with something, or I was just tired. I turned to head back to the desk, ready to laugh it off, when the lights flickered. Not a full blackout, just a quick blink, like a power surge. But when they came back on, I heard it again. Not tapping this time, scratching. Slow, deliberate scratches, like nails dragging across metal coming from inside drawer 12. I froze. Every hair on my neck stood up, and I swear the room got colder. Not just more cold, but something deeper, something that sank into your skin. I swung the flashlight toward the drawer, even though the overhead lights were plenty bright, and watched the door like it was about to burst open. The scratching went on for maybe 10 seconds, then stopped. I didn't move, didn't breathe, just waited. That's when the phone rang. It was the desk line shrieking through the silence, and I damn near jumped out of my skin. I bolted back to the front, grabbed the receiver, and barked. "Yeah, what?" My voice was shakier than I wanted it to be. "Jake? You good, man?" It was Tom, sounding stuffed up but concerned. "I just had the weirdest feeling, like I needed to check on you." I glanced back at the storage room. Yeah, I'm fine," I lied. "Just quiet night. You okay?" "Yeah, just this damn flu." "Hey, you didn't open drawer 12, did you?" My stomach dropped. "What? Why?" He coughed, then said, "That Jane Doe they brought in. I heard the EMTs talking when they dropped her off. Said she was DOA, but the paramedics swore she twitched or something on the way over. They figured it was just nerves, but I don't know, man. Sounded creepy. I didn't tell him about the tapping or the scratching. I just said, nah, she's locked up tight. All good here." We shot the breeze for a minute, and I hung up, feeling a little steadier with his voice in my head. But I wasn't about to go back to that drawer. Not yet. The rest of the night dragged on. I stayed at the desk, kept the radio on low, some late-night talk show about Bigfoot or whatever, just to fill the silence. I told myself it was over, that I'd spooked myself for no reason. Around 3 a.m., I had to do my rounds, though. Couldn't avoid it. Check the logs, make sure the temps on the units were holding, standard stuff. I grabbed my clipboard and forced myself back into the storage room. Everything looked normal. The drawers were all closed, the air was still, no weird noises. I moved fast, ticking off boxes on my checklist, avoiding looking at drawer 12 for too long. But as I turned to leave, I saw it, or thought I did. A shadow, just for a split second, moving across the wall near the drawers. Not my shadow. The angle was wrong, and I wasn't even casting one there. It was tall, thin, and gone before I could blink. I didn't stick around to investigate. I booked it back to the desk, locked the door to the storage room behind me, something we never do, and sat there staring at the clock, willing the sun to come up. The rest of the shift was quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Not just from the storage room, but from everywhere. The corners, the vents, the reflections in the glass. When my relief showed up at 6 a.m., I didn't say a word about it. Just grabbed my jacket and hauled ass out of there. Driving home, I kept replaying it in my head. The taps, the scratches, that shadow. I told myself it was exhaustion, or maybe the morgue was messing with me after all those months. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just my imagination. I called out sick the next night, couldn't bring myself to go back. Tom texted me later, said everything was normal when he went in. No weird noises, no nothing. I didn't tell him what happened. Didn't want him thinking I was losing it. But I started looking for a new job that week, something with daylight and living people. I'm still not sure what went down in drawer 12 that night. Maybe it was Jane Doe. Maybe it was something else. All I know is I'm never working the graveyard shift again. This happened to me when I was in 4th grade, and now I'm 42 years old. As we know, the internet as we know it wasn't really around back then, so unfortunately, I don't have any newspaper articles to back up my story. But I still remember everything that happened that day. The day my friend nearly lost her innocence and maybe even her life. Here's the story behind the story. I've always had this weird habit that I still carry with me to this day. I don't know why, but I always walked on my tiptoes when heading to school. I got picked on a lot for it. No matter how hard I tried to walk flat-footed, I'd always end up back on my toes. This led my family to believe I was destined to be a ballerina, even though I did love dancing. But I was also a tomboy who preferred climbing trees over wearing dresses. So when my mom, who worked 2 jobs, took me to the community center and signed me up for ballet classes, I figured I'd have to learn to like skirts. My dance teacher's name was Ms. Nadine. She was impressed with my skills but didn't care for my height or my looks or my family's financial situation since it was an expensive class. At the end of my audition, I was told I was too tall and clumsy, a great way to boost a young girl's confidence. As I left the room and walked into the hallway, I overheard Ms. Nadine whisper that she wouldn't teach poor kids. I stopped, turned around, and apologized. And that's when she said it again. I don't teach poor kids. My face turned so red my ears felt purple. Right then I decided I'd give her a piece of my mind, or maybe more, before I could act on it. That's when I felt a hand on my shoulder, followed by a man's voice. There's a fighter in you. Ever thought about trying karate? It was Mr. Torres, a well-known and respected karate instructor in our county. He wanted me to try his class and even offered to take me on for free. I'd be his first girl student, but he saw potential in me. I still owe him so much for that. When I started training, he noticed my tiptoe walking and instead of mocking me, showed me how to turn it into a weapon. My legs were already muscular from calves to thighs, and I could kick harder than a mule. Around that time, our small coastal North Carolina town was being terrorized by a man who'd been abducting young girls. He'd force them to do what he wanted, and when he was done, he'd tie their hands, blindfold them, drive to another town, and dump them in the middle of the night. He was a sick bastard. He didn't kill any of his victims, but people thought he was getting more violent with each incident. Mr. Torres would adjust our lessons for a week or 2 after each attack, teaching us how to use our momentum to fight off attackers and escape. Eyes, nose, groin, face. He said if we were attacked, we should claw and scratch at their face and eyes. Not only could it blind them, but it'd make them easier to identify later. More importantly, he stressed the buddy system. He told us not to scream rape because, sadly, while many want to stop it, people don't want to see it or carry that image in their minds. Instead, he said to yell, "Fire," or "My arm's falling off." The latter sounded silly, but he insisted it worked. People can't help but look at a fire, and even more so if someone's arm is supposedly coming off. Now to the day in question. It was 1990, springtime, and I was in 4th grade. I was with my best friend, who I'll call Mara. Mara and I decided to take a little walk around our neighborhood. It had 2 main entrances and formed a loop with 2 parallel streets between them. Houses lined each road, spaced no more than 1.5 acres apart, some even closer. It was easy to slip in one entrance and out the other without being seen, even if you paid attention to passing cars. Back then, we kept time by the streetlights. The rule was, when they came on, if you didn't want to go home, you'd better head back anyway. Mara and I were on the main road toward the back, just a couple of young girls talking about boys we liked, and the boogeyman terrorizing our state. A girl we knew, Tanya, was his latest victim. She'd gone from outgoing to a regular in the psych ward. She even tried to take her own life at one point. As we talked about this, I glanced over my shoulder and saw a strange car creeping toward us, real slow. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It was a faded maroon Pontiac. The driver reminded me of someone creepy. Curly blonde hair, thick, red-framed glasses, and a smile that gave me chills. His window was down, and he pulled up beside us. "Hey, girls," he said. "I'm trying to pay my electric bill, but I can't seem to find the office. Can you tell me how to get there from here?" Funny thing was, the only electric company in our town was less than a mile from our neighborhood. I could have cut straight through the woods and ended up at their front door. The only way to pay was at the office itself. Small town, early 90s. He kept saying he had to get there to avoid getting his power cut off, even though he'd supposedly been there before. I pointed out, that's where you pay to turn it on, so just go there. That's when I noticed an open map on the passenger seat next to him. He said his mom had the power turned on, that he was new to the area, just back from deployment. Something struck me as odd. His hair was a bit long for a military guy, and he didn't have a base sticker. We had 2 bases nearby, Camp Lejeune and Cherry Point. Both my grandpas had served. "Please, just show me on the map here," he said, motioning Mara toward his car. Mara clearly didn't sense something was off. I looked around. No one else was outside. I snapped my attention. Back to Mara and the man. Mr. Torres's voice echoed in my head. "Fight if you can't flee. Something bad will happen to Mara if you don't." As soon as Mara got close enough, pure evil flashed across the man's face. Imagine a human turning into a demonic creature. That's the best way I can describe it. "Thanks, sweetie. Just show me right here." He locked eyes with me and gave a weak smile. I grabbed Mara fast. "Wait, don't lean in." Mara's scream echoed down the street. I looked up and saw the man had reached across the passenger seat and grabbed her arm. The car started rolling forward as he tried to pull her in. I yelled as I wrapped my arms around Mara's upper body, yanking her back as hard as I could. I knew it had hurt when I hit the asphalt, but that was fine as long as I held on to Mara. We both crashed onto the road, and it hurt like hell, just as I'd expected. By then, some neighbors had heard us screaming and come outside. I dragged Mara to safety as the car sped off. One witness, my friend Brandon's mom, got the license plate and a detailed description of the driver and his car. That man we met that day was the monster preying on young girls in North Carolina. I don't remember his name. My mom did her best to shield me from the aftermath, and I only got worse about asking later. Now that I'm a mom myself, I understand better. She was proud of me and my actions that day. Mara's grateful too, and I'm glad to say she's doing okay. Tanya, the girl I mentioned earlier, is an example of what could have happened to her if I hadn't stepped in. Tanya's had a rough life and doesn't really talk to anyone anymore. I don't know all the details, but the monster was eventually locked up. The description of the car and driver from our neighborhood helped catch him. I often think back to that day at the community center, where I was mocked by someone who thought I wasn't worth investing in. But against all odds, Mr. Torres saw potential in that tall, clumsy girl who walked on her toes. His voice guided me that day, and without him, I couldn't have saved Mara. This happened when I was just 7 years old. Back then, my parents would always take me to my grandma's house on weekends. I loved staying with her. We'd walk around the neighborhood chatting with people she knew. My grandma, whom I'll call Nana, was a deeply religious woman, and we often went to church with lots of folks from her community. It was a tight-knit, friendly group. They'd hold garage sales on weekends during the warmer months, and those events always drew a decent crowd. One weekend, my parents decided to join us for one of these sales. I was thrilled. Usually we'd just wander around looking at stuff, rarely buying anything. That day we ended up at a house with boxes of toys lined up along the driveway. It was a place we'd never been to before, and we didn't know the people who lived there. When I saw all those toys, I felt like I'd hit the jackpot. While I was busy digging through my newfound treasures, Nana and my parents were a few feet away, checking out some dishes and furniture, talking to a few other folks. An older man, probably in his 60s, came over to me. He watched me sort through the boxes with a smile on his face. "Well, aren't you a lovely young lady?" he said. "Do you like toys?" I eagerly nodded and said yes without a second thought. I was about to run over to my mom to ask if I could buy a toy horse I'd found, but before I could, he said, "You can keep it for free," and handed it to me, still smiling. Then he started picking out a few more toys from the boxes, giving them to me, insisting I could have anything I wanted. He told me he had even more toys inside the house that I could play with and suggested I come with him to see them. Before I knew it, I was being led toward his house. Just then, my mom, let's call her Lena, came up behind me, yanked me away from him, and demanded to know what the heck was going on. She was furious, holding me tight and glaring at the man. She must have seen what was happening right in the nick of time and stepped in. My dad, call him Milo, and Nana were right behind her. The man didn't say a word as Lena and Nana started yelling at him. Their shouting caught everyone's attention, and people around us immediately grew suspicious. I don't remember exactly what they said because Milo scooped me up and carried me back to the car. I do recall Nana calling the police before we left. At the time, I didn't grasp how serious the situation was. It wasn't until years later that I learned the man went to the same church as Nana and had been involved in tons of church events, including ones for kids and teens. Apparently, the police found a stash of child pornography on his computer, and he was sent to prison not long after. I was 19 when I found out, and it still gives me chills to think about what might have happened if Lena hadn't seen him in time. Thank God she did. Back in 2001, I was working for a big home improvement warehouse. Let's say the company had a thing for the color orange. By that point, I'd been with them for about 8 years. My previous gig was in HR, assisting regional and store managers, but the company scrapped that role. So I asked to move to the RTV department, short for return to vendor. The timing was perfect since the girl in that position had just put in her 2 weeks' notice. The job was all about working with different vendors to get money back for the store for defective merchandise. Our return policy was pretty lax in 2001, and some folks brought in the wildest stuff, like a garbage disposal infested with maggots, an ancient corded drill that wasn't even made anymore, you could tell by the serial number, faulty lawnmowers, and half-assembled shelves. I'd seen it all. My RTV cage, as they called it, was set up in the receiving department at the back of the store. It was a 12-foot-high chain-link enclosure with a swinging gate I'd lock whenever I stepped out for lunch or clocked out for the day. I had my computer perched on a makeshift stand where I'd process credits and get vendors to sign off on them. You couldn't see inside the cage from the outside because of all the busted merchandise stacked up around it. One day, a vendor showed up to sort out some defective molding. I was at my computer facing away from him while he inspected the goods, both the products and apparently me. Out of nowhere he said, "I'll give you credit for everything here." I was about to turn around and say, "Great, thanks." But I froze when I saw a wrinkled flesh-colored thing hanging out of his zipper. He just stood there, hands on his hips like it was no big deal. That didn't just slip out. I spun back to my computer, feeling faint. I figured it was best to act like it didn't happen. Without looking at him, I handed over the RTV form for him to sign. He said, "See you in a few weeks," and left. I stayed in the cage for a bit to pull myself together, then marched to the manager's office to tell him what happened. I also called up the regional manager. They loved their acronyms, and his response was, "Well, what did you expect?" Then he started laughing. This was over 20 years ago, mind you. I'll be straight. I was pretty cute back then. Tan, fit, always did my hair and makeup no matter what. But I didn't expect that from someone I had to do business with. The manager's reaction basically implied I should expect and accept that kind of treatment now and then, and they weren't going to do a thing about it. I called the company the sausage guy worked for, and they brushed it off with, "Yeah, we'll look into it." A couple of weeks later, a coworker came up to me and said, "Did you hear? That molding guy pulled the same stunt with a cashier. He's banned from the store now." So, the creep didn't even get fired. Looking back, should I have sued? I might be rich now. Or maybe I should have laughed it off and said, "Is that all you've got? I've seen bigger on a newborn." Hindsight's always 20/20, right? In that moment, though, I was stunned. It was the last thing I ever expected to happen. I've never been good at asking for help. Maybe that's why I'm writing this now, sitting in a motel room I can barely afford, instead of talking to someone who might actually know what to do. My hands won't stop trembling, and every time I close my eyes, I see him, or hear him, climbing those stairs. This isn't a story I want to tell. It's a story I have to tell, because if I don't get it out of me, I think it'll rot inside my skull until there's nothing left. I moved into the house 6 months ago. It's one of those narrow 2-story rentals tucked at the end of a dead-end street, the kind of place nobody notices unless they're looking for it. I'd been laid off from my job at the auto shop, and my savings were bleeding out fast. The rent was cheap. The landlord didn't ask questions, and I figured I could make it work until I got back on my feet. It wasn't perfect. Faded wallpaper, a leaky faucet, stairs that groaned like they were in pain. But it was mine. Just me, my dog Riley, and a couple boxes of stuff I hadn't bothered to unpack. The first few weeks were fine. Quiet. Riley, my scruffy little mutt, would bark at squirrels through the back window, and I'd spend my days sending out resumes trying to pretend I wasn't drowning in debt. Then about a month in, I started noticing things. Small things at first, like how the back door would be unlocked when I came downstairs in the morning. I'd swear I'd locked it the night before, but there it was, the knob turning freely in my hand. I told myself I was being careless, that unemployment was making me sloppy. I started double-checking it every night, sliding the deadbolt home with a satisfying click. Problem solved, right? Wrong. One night, I woke up to Riley growling. Not his usual squirrel-chasing yap. This was low, guttural, the kind of sound that comes from deep in a dog's chest when it's scared. I sat up in bed, the room pitch black except for the faint glow of streetlights seeping through the blinds. Riley was at the foot of the bed, ears flat, staring at the door. I listened, heart thudding, and that's when I heard it. A faint thump from downstairs, like a boot hitting the hardwood floor. I grabbed my phone and the baseball bat I kept under the bed, left over from pickup games with my old coworkers, and crept to the top of the stairs. Riley stayed close, his growls vibrating against my leg. The house was silent now, but it didn't feel empty. It felt heavy, like the air was holding its breath. I flicked on the hallway light and called out, "Who's there?" My voice cracked, sounding smaller than I wanted it to. No answer, just Riley's growling and my pulse hammering in my ears. I made my way downstairs, bat raised, checking every corner. Living room, kitchen, the tiny pantry by the back door, nothing. The back door was locked, deadbolt still in place. I even checked the windows, all latched tight. Riley calmed down eventually, sniffing around like nothing had happened, and I convinced myself it was a raccoon or the wind knocking something over outside. I went back to bed, but I didn't sleep. The next night it happened again. Same time, around 2 a.m. Riley's growling woke me, and there was that thump downstairs. This time I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the bat and stormed down, flipping on every light as I went. Nothing. No one. Just the locked door, the quiet house, and Riley pacing nervously behind me. I started to feel stupid, like I was jumping at shadows. But when I went back upstairs, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. A muddy footprint on the bottom step. Not big, not small, just a faint smear, like someone had brushed it off but not well enough. I don't wear boots inside, and Riley's paws don't leave prints like that. I scrubbed it away with a rag, telling myself it was old, left by the last tenant, or maybe me tracking in dirt weeks ago. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there, standing right where I'd stood, looking up at my bedroom door. Things got worse after that. The noises started coming every night. Thump, thump, thump. Always around 2 a.m., always from downstairs. Sometimes it was just one step, sometimes a few, like someone was testing the stairs, seeing how far they could go before I'd notice. Riley stopped sleeping through it. He'd huddle against me, trembling, his eyes fixed on the door. I stopped, sleeping too. I'd lie there, bat in hand, listening to those slow, deliberate steps, waiting for them to reach the top. They never did. Not at first. I installed a cheap security camera from the hardware store, pointing it at the back door and stairs. The footage was grainy, but it'd catch anything moving. The first night with it, I felt a little safer, like I had proof, control. I stayed, up watching the live feed on my phone, the screen casting a pale glow over my face. At 2 a.m., the steps started. Thump, thump. I checked the feed. Nothing. Just the empty kitchen, the locked door, the stairs bathed in dim light. But I heard it, clear as anything, right below me. Riley whimpered, pressing himself into my side. I rewatched the footage after sunrise, hours of nothing. No shadows, no movement, just static silence. I called a locksmith the next day. He replaced the deadbolt, added a chain, told me the old lock was fine, but maybe I'd feel better with something new. I didn't tell him about the footsteps. How do you explain that to a guy who smells like WD-40 and thinks you're just paranoid? I started keeping the bat next to me on the couch, stopped going upstairs unless I had to. I'd sit there all night, lights on, waiting. 2 nights ago, it changed. I was dozing on the couch when Riley bolted upright, hackles raised, The clock read 1:58 a.m. I grabbed the bat, my mouth dry, and listened. Thump. The first step. Thump. The second. Then a pause. So long I thought it was over. Riley growled, low and fierce. Thump. The third step. My breath caught. It was closer than it had ever been. I stared at the stairwell, just out of sight from the couch, waiting for a shadow, a shape, anything. Thump. The fourth step. My hands tightened around the bat. There are 12 stairs to the top. He was a third of the way up. I don't know why I didn't call the cops then. Fear, maybe, or some stupid part of me still thinking I could handle it. The steps kept coming. Thump. 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 Slow, steady, like he had all the time in the world. Riley barked once, sharp and panicked, and I shushed him, my voice shaking. Thump. 8 steps. I stood, legs wobbly, and moved toward the stairwell. Thump. 9. I could hear breathing now, shallow, raspy, right around the corner. Thump. 10. I swung around the wall, bat raised, screaming something incoherent. And there he was. He was halfway up the stairs, one hand on the railing, frozen mid-step. Tall, wiry, dressed in a stained coat that hung off him like a scarecrow's rags. His face was gaunt, eyes sunken and wild, glinting in the light from downstairs. He didn't flinch, didn't run, just stared at me, lips curling into a crooked smile. "Hey, Jake," he said, voice rough like he hadn't spoken in days. Been a while. I didn't know him. I'd never seen him before in my life. But he knew my name, and the way he said it, casual, familiar, made my skin crawl. I shouted at him to get out, swinging the bat wild. He ducked quick as a cat and bolted back down the stairs, vanishing into the kitchen. I chased after him, adrenaline pumping, but when I got there, the back door was still locked, chain on, deadbolt secure. No windows open, no trace of him. Just Riley barking and the smell of sweat and something sour hanging in the air. I called the cops this time. They searched the house, the yard, the street. Nothing. No footprints, no sign of a break-in. They asked if I'd been drinking, if I was sure I hadn't dreamed it. I showed them the camera footage, empty stairs, even as I swore he'd been there. They left skeptical, telling me to call if it happened again. Last night I couldn't stay. I grabbed Riley a bag of clothes and drove to this motel. But as I was leaving, I heard it, one last thump from the stairs, echoing through the empty house. I didn't look back. I don't know who he was, how he got in, or why he knew me. I keep replaying his voice. Been a while. Like it's a clue I'm too dumb to crack. I'm scared to go back, scared he's still there, waiting. If anyone's dealt with this, an intruder who shouldn't be possible, tell me. Because I don't think he's gone, I think he's just getting started. This happened at the end of October last year in Ottawa, Ontario. I'd gone back to my old hometown to visit my parents, which is always a bit of a grueling effort, so I usually try to spend as little time in their house as possible. To kill. Sometime one night I decided to go for a jog around the neighborhood where I grew up, around 10:30 p.m. I'd really been pushing myself lately, quit drinking and was trying to burn off the extra belly fat I'd gained from boozing and being lazy during the lockdown. Basically, I ran a loop around the area, passing through 3 parks. The third park I had to jog through had no streetlights, just one lamp right in the middle, but Ottawa has this thing where the lights randomly shut off. It's some city. Grid trick to save money and power, and 9 times out of 10, that park is pitch black. It's especially dark on a quiet October night with a clear sky and dry ground. The road leading into the park was well lit. This is a peaceful, quaint, sleepy suburb. That said, some sketchy stuff has gone down in this little area before. For instance, just a 6-minute walk from my parents' place was one of the biggest drug busts our city's ever seen. An armed gang with illegal automatic weapons. The whole deal. There have also been a couple of stabbings and other incidents, but they're few and far between and usually sorted out by the law real quick. Overall, it's a weirdly safe and clean place to raise a family if I ever had kids. Or to retire. Canada's great for that. I've never felt unsafe, especially in my parents' neighborhood where there are loads of gorgeous homes. In the darkness, I entered the park and passed the first section. A small playground structure for kids. Just a little wooden house next to a trickling creek that leads to a bigger part of the park with a basketball court, a wooded play area, and a much larger playground structure with a big green plastic triceratops in the sandbox. Eventually, all of this feeds into a path running behind my old elementary school. At the end of that path is my street. I was almost done with my run, jogging through this creepy, dark park I'd crossed hundreds of times before. I've got a habit of falling asleep to spooky stories, and had been watching a ton of horror movies lately. As I stepped into the blackness from the adjacent street leading into the park, I was debating taking a break and walking, but I reminded myself I was trying to push harder. I kept going, jokingly thinking to myself, man, I really hope nothing creepy happens. But as I rounded the corner to the other half of the park, I heard a distant scraping sound. I noticed a light from someone's phone glowing in the sandbox. As I jogged closer, the scraping got louder. I got nearer and saw by the moonlight a guy holding one of those rigid, sharp-toothed rakes, grooming the sand. Now my gut told me this was bizarre. Why some dude raking a sandbox at nearly 11 p.m. with a flashlight? As I got closer, though, I realized it wasn't just a guy with a sharp rake. It was a man dressed in an all-black tracksuit, hoodie up, wearing a white hospital mask. He was standing under the play structure, using the rake to push a pink toy horse on wheels back and forth over and over. He heard my footsteps approaching, and his head snapped straight toward me. He quickly ducked out from under the play structure and shone his light right into my eyes. Weird, I thought, blinking at him in total confusion and exhaustion. I've got asthma and my quads and lungs were giving out. I tried my best to pick up the pace because, at this point, I was pretty freaked out. In a flash, he switched off the light, and I couldn't see a damn thing. My heart leaped into my throat. I was so tired, ready to collapse, when I heard a faint shuffle in the sand as I passed him, followed by fast footsteps between my own, getting closer and louder. Right away I realized this guy was charging at me with the rake. It's insane what fear and adrenaline can do. I went from 0 to 100, sprinting faster than I ever have, my whole body burning, especially my lungs. As I bolted through the park and onto the lit street, I was moving so fast and panting so loud I couldn't even tell if he was chasing me. I didn't look back. I tore down the path, and as I reached my street, I saw some guy stepping out of his car. With him as a witness, I turned around, gasping and wheezing. The rake guy was gone. I trudged back to my street and into the house, spitting out a massive, gross wad of phlegm drenched in sweat. At first, I avoided telling my parents this story just to dodge their reaction, but everyone else in my life found out pretty quick. I didn't care enough to call the cops. It didn't even cross my mind. Later, when I reconnected with an old friend who never left Ottawa, she told me my old elementary school had been turned into a homeless shelter. At night, they'd camp out in the gym and get kicked out by 6 a.m. Her take was that it might have been some mentally unwell homeless person, bored and sleepless. But what if he had other intentions? Was he waiting for a jogger to pass by? Was he trying to scare people for kicks? Or was he actually in a violent mood? Guess I'll never know. A few years ago, when I was still in high school, I was hanging out with some friends during lunch and they started talking about the deep web. My friend Marcus had been on it before and he shared some stories with us. We spent the whole lunch period talking about the deep web, and I got really curious about it. I decided I wanted to check it out later that day. After school, when I got home, my curiosity got the better of me, and I made up my mind to try accessing it. I texted Marcus, and he told me which browser to get and what steps to follow. I did exactly what he said, and soon enough I was in. I started searching for some deep websites to visit. The first one I stumbled upon was just a black screen with a tiny icon in the top left corner. When I clicked it, I was taken to a page filled with random images. No context at all. Some were of animals like fish or bears, while others were just a bunch of random objects. I clicked on the fish and the page started loading. It took forever, probably about 30 seconds or so. When it finally loaded, I saw my own face staring back at me on the screen. It was coming from my webcam. I freaked out, ran to my bed, grabbed a blanket and threw it over the webcam. The screen went black after that. I let out a sigh of relief, but then some text started appearing on the screen, like it was being typed out in real time. The first thing it said was my name. Not just my first name, but my full name, middle name and last name included. That really scared me. Then, to my horror, more personal information started popping up. It listed the school I went to, my phone number, and even the state and city where I lived. I couldn't take it anymore and tried to close the browser, but it wouldn't work. My mouse froze. I tried pressing Ctrl+Alt+Delete over and over, but nothing happened. I started panicking and smashing random keys on the keyboard. I even tried turning off the monitor, but that didn't do anything either. Then I hit the power button on the computer. Still nothing. In a full-on panic, I ran to the power strip plugged into the wall and yanked the cord out. Everything shut off at that point. I sat there stunned for a few minutes before plugging the computer back in. I immediately deleted the browser. Luckily, I'd been planning to get a new computer for a while, and I bought one shortly after. I'll never forget that experience with the deep web. The events I'm about to describe happened during my second year of college in 2012. Honestly, I can't recall the exact month, but I'm pretty sure it was sometime in the winter. I was living with my two roommates, Mia and Tara, and we were the best of friends, tight as could be. We just moved into our first off-campus house, basking in the freedom of being out of the dorms. With that change came some experimentation, drugs and alcohol mostly. The three of us started hanging out and partying with a group of people who eventually got into heavier stuff like cocaine, Molly, and the like. After a while, Mia and I decided the constant partying was taking a toll on our health and studies, so we stepped back from it. Tara, though, she kept going, diving deeper into it, and she started getting more aggressive. I should say up front that I don't judge anyone for drug use, but I'm mentioning it because I think it might have played a big role in what happened later. It all kicked off one weekend when we decided to hit up a party together, but ended up getting separated. I'd arranged to leave early and Tara had agreed to walk home with Mia. We were strict about the buddy system at night. But that night it fell apart. Tara left the party with someone else, leaving Mia to walk home alone. Unfortunately, a strange guy followed her. To this day, I feel crushing guilt for bailing that night, but I've come to terms with the choices I made back then. When I got home the next morning, Mia told me about her night. She was shaken up, which was so unlike her usual upbeat self. She said she'd texted Tara at some point, telling her how upset she was about walking home alone. Mia was frustrated and her messages were blunt. Tara, though, didn't just brush it off or apologize like we expected. She flipped out. She fired back with this defensive, over-the-top rant, telling Mia in the most colorful terms to basically shut up and get over it. We thought it was weird and hostile, but we tried to move on and not dwell on it. That Monday, Mia left for her job at the student rec center, and I headed to class in the afternoon. While I was in lecture, Tara showed up at Mia's workplace and started screaming in her face in front of over 60 people, calling her every name in the book. Security escorted her out, but somehow she made it back to our house. Oh, and I should mention, Tara's mom was visiting that week and staying with us. I think she was terrified of her own daughter, which is probably why she never stepped in. By the time I got home from class, I was in the kitchen cooking. Tara's rage was still aimed at Mia, not me, so I tried to let them sort it out without getting involved. But then Tara cornered me in the kitchen, venting about how furious she was with Mia. I'd never seen that kind of fury in someone's eyes before. I refused to engage, just backed off to my room at the back of the house. I sat on my bed taking deep breaths, trying to calm down. That's when I heard Mia come up the side yard. She was sobbing on the phone with her mom, telling her what had gone down at work. My stomach dropped. I knew they were about to clash again. The door swung open, and Mia walked in. I was still in my room when I heard them start yelling at each other. Mia stood her ground, telling Tara she'd gone too far, and Tara shot back with more profanity. The shouting turned into full-on screaming. I'd had enough, so I stormed into the living room where they were going at it. Tara's mom was there too, just watching. I told Tara to stop and leave, but she told me to get lost. That gave Mia a chance to bolt toward her room, but Tara chased her and slammed Mia's hand in the door as she tried to barricade herself. Things were spiraling out of control. I stepped out onto the front porch, and Mia followed me a few seconds later. Then we heard Tara's mom yell, begging her to put something down. We locked eyes, horrified. I told Mia to run and call 911. Right then, Tara burst through the front door, holding a massive kitchen knife above her head, screaming at Mia that she was going to kill her. By now, our neighbors were outside, trying to figure out what the hell was happening. I'm not one for confrontation, but I wasn't about to let someone murder my best friend. In a split-second decision, I tackled Tara and somehow managed to wrestle the knife from her grip, tossing it into the front yard. I ran to grab it, but Tara darted back inside and came out with another knife. This time she turned it on herself, asking me if I wanted to watch her do it. Everything had gone completely off the rails. Her mom was hysterical, and I kept begging her to stop Tara. Then I blacked out. When I came to, I was running down the street with Mia. We took shelter at a neighbor's house while Tara's blood-curdling screams still echoed down the block. We were in shock, but so grateful for the neighbors who took us in until the cops arrived. We saw the police show up a little later along with a crisis unit. They arrested Tara and took her to a hospital, where she was admitted for a psych evaluation. Mia and I never saw her again. We crashed with some mutual friends for a few weeks before moving out of that house for good at the end of the year. It held too many awful memories. Later, I found out Tara had gone through a psychotic break, triggered by a mix of drug use, stress, and an undiagnosed mental health condition. It was a huge wake-up call for me to educate myself about mental health in young people. It also made me appreciate the incredible things your body can do in fight or flight mode. More than anything, it taught me to trust my gut. I'd sensed something off about Tara before, but I'd ignored it. So this happened yesterday, and I'm still pretty shaken up. Just to give you some backstory, I'm a 25-year-old woman, and my boyfriend and I both have jobs that let us work from home or the office. Yesterday morning I was exhausted, so I decided to work from home since my boyfriend Ryan had gone into the office. That left me alone all day with just our dog and cat for company. The day started out normal, like any other work day at home, and I took a break around 1:30 p.m. That's when things took a turn. I'd just hopped into a work meeting when the doorbell rang. We have one of those doorbells with a camera that sends alerts to Ryan's phone. I texted him and asked if he could check who it was. He said it was an older man who looked sketchy and told me not to answer the door. So I ignored it and went back to my meeting. 20 minutes later, I finished the call and picked up my phone. I always keep it on Do Not Disturb while working. The second I checked it, I saw all these missed calls and texts from Ryan. Panicking, I called him back right away. He was freaking out, asking why I hadn't answered. I told him I'd been in a meeting and he told me to look out the window because the guy still hadn't left our house. I tiptoed quietly to the front window and peeked out. Sure enough, there he was in our driveway. He'd parked his beat-up old truck right next to my car and was pacing back and forth, looking shady as hell. He had on dirty jeans and a grimy, gray tank top. My heart started pounding and I bolted to the bedroom. I tried calming myself down, thinking maybe he'd just gotten the wrong house, but no. He started peering through our windows, trying to see inside. Then he went for our side gate, tugging at it. Thankfully, it was locked. By this point, our big dog was losing it, barking and growling at the front door. I was still on the phone with Ryan, who was watching the guy live on the camera app. I asked him what I should do because I was in full-on panic mode, totally alone. "Call 911, he said firmly. With shaky hands, I did. While waiting for the cops, I texted my mom, Lena, to let her know what was happening. She dropped everything and said she was on her way. The guy was still creeping around, peering through our windows. I had no clue what his intentions were, but judging by his vibe, it didn't feel good. I was terrified he'd spot me. Then, as the police rolled down the street, he saw them, jumped into his truck, and peeled out. I ran outside to the cops, and by then Lena pulled up, tears streaming down her face. I explained everything, and luckily she'd caught the guy's license plate. The police took it down along with his description and said they'd keep an eye out for him. I know this might not sound as terrifying as some other stories, but when you're alone and some guy's peering into your house, refusing to leave, you have no idea what he's planning. It's horrifying. I couldn't sleep last night. I kept imagining him coming back to finish whatever he started. I'm hoping the police call with an update since we've got his plate number. If they do, I'll let you know. And to the creepy guy who wouldn't leave my house, please don't come back.